I'm Robin Dowling. I'm the Dean of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's on their land that the University of Sydney sits, including Conservatorium, where we are this evening, and pay my respect to elders past and present. My pleasure is to just welcome you. Thank you for this amazing event that we are able to put on as part of the Penelope Professorship in Architectural History. And I'm just going to simply pass you over to my colleague, Professor Andrew Leach, who will introduce the proceedings. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin, and good evening, everybody. In this inaugural year of the Penelope Visiting Professorship in Architectural History, we've been working with Professor Jean-Louis Cohen of New York University to explore the theme of transference. Taking up the idea of frottage, he invites us to think about the history of architecture as a series of instances in which impressions, quotations, encounters, and translations form a terrain of ideas and works, and through them, cities and landscapes, in a sustained conversation between architects and their interlocutors across vast geographies. Tonight's talk advances this theme directly. What does an architect take from one place to another? How does he, in this case, shape a city through his experiences? This is the next in a series of events running across the balance of the year that explores this theme in different ways, culminating in a public lecture by Cohen himself, details of which we anticipate advising very soon. Now, while many of you, I know tonight's speaker, or at least will be familiar with his books and exhibitions, I'd still like to offer some brief words of introduction. Philip Goad is Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor and Chair of Architecture at the University of Melbourne, where he's taught for most of his career. Anyone who asks who the foremost historian of Australian architecture is will likely hear Philip's name in response. He's published widely on the subject and regularly contributes to public debate. His books include collaborative works on the legacies of the Bauhaus in Australia, on hospitals, on the Australian House, on Australians' modern movement heritage, on the architectural history of Melbourne and Victoria. Together with Julie Willis, he edited the Encyclopedia of Australian Architecture, published more than a decade ago now with Cambridge University Press. To quickly become an invaluable reference on that subject. He has held the Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard, another distinguished appointment, from which we look forward to the definitive monograph on the critic and architect Robin Boyd. Philip has fingers in many pies, including ongoing work with a number of us here in Sydney. Besides much else, he is a former president of the Society of Architectural Historians, Australia and New Zealand, and current chair of the Heritage Council of Victoria. He is, and I can speak of this personally, a supportive and generous colleague to all who work in the discipline of architectural history, and we welcome the opportunity to hear him speak this evening. His theme, as you can see behind me, is New World, Harry Seidler, Brazil, and the Australian City. Please join me in welcoming Philip Goad.
Great. Look, thanks very much, Andrew. You're very, very, very generous. So this evening, I'd like also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting here this evening, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to the knowledge embedded forever within Aboriginal custodianship of country. It's an honour and also a rare pleasure to be able to travel again, to come to Sydney and to present this lecture, which has been made possible by funds that support the Penelope Visiting Professorship in Architectural History at the University of Sydney. I'm especially grateful to Penelope Seidler for her public commitment to furthering the study of Australian architectural history. I'd also like to thank Professor Andrew Leach for his invitation to present my research on Harry Seidler in Brazil, and to the Dean, Professor Robin Dowling, for the hospitality that she and her colleagues, and especially Steve Burns and his team, have been able to give me. through the funds of the Penelope Visiting Professorship. Of the paper that I'm presenting this evening, I must also acknowledge the support and research made available to me by a number of people. I'd like to thank again Penelope Seidler and also the following for their expert advice and opinions, and these include Polly Seidler, especially for access to rare slides taken by Harry Seidler in Brazil in 1948, to Colin Griffiths, who's here this evening, to Eric Sierens, James Werrick from the University of New South Wales, Daniel Ryan and Cameron Logan from the University of Sydney, Elizabeth Musgrave from the University of Queensland, Brett Tippie from Kent State University in the US, and Macarena de la Vega, formerly of ACHUTCH at the University of Melbourne. It's really my emphasis to show you that researchers need friends, and I've got a lot here this evening who have given me great support. So, to tonight's lecture, New World, Harry Seidler, South America and the Australian City. In Australian architectural histories, the idea of South-South dialogues between South America, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand have been little studied. Only very recently has there been a concerted effort to document 19th century trans-Tasman exchanges in architecture between Australia and New Zealand, in an effort to overcome previously nationally focused studies. Nonetheless, the geographically expanded connections between Australia, South Africa and South America have been overlooked almost entirely, partly because such connections tend to fall outside those engendered by the dominant networks with the British Empire and the United States. Travel alone would suggest that those en route to Australia by ship before the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 and the Panama Canal in 1914 would have stopped off for supplies in Cape Town and often, prior to that, in Rio de Janeiro, a phenomenon noted by James Broadbent in his various accounts of earlier colonial life in Australia. Now, the documentation of 20th century architectural connections between Australia and South America is slight. Christopher Vernon has discussed the relationship between two New World capital cities, Brasilia and Canberra. Otherwise, Australian connections with South America have been given only cursory attention, mostly with passing reference to the work of Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer, through visual aspects of style and form, but little else. And in this regard, the name of Sydney architect Harry Seidler is invoked again and again. In every monograph on Seidler, his early contact with Niemeyer in 1948 has been noted, but never really examined in any depth, nor for its potential longevity as a career-informing influence. Indeed, in 1980, the architecture historian Donald Leslie Johnson described Seidler's interest in Niemeyer as a mere, and I quote, a fleeting romance. My lecture this evening will argue the opposite. It will place Seidler's interest in Brazil within the Australian context, where knowledge and familiarity with the forms and ideas of Macarena de la Vega told me to use this expression, Ibero-American modernism were known and understood, but appeared only in isolated examples. By contrast, Seidler's Brazilian experience was profound, and it gave him the tools to adapt his modernist language to the Australian climate without compromise, and to realise his ultimate project for the Australian city, a modern Baroque in the Antipodes. He proposed a new vision for the Australian city, one that extended Siegfried Gideon, Josep Louis Sert and Fernand Léger's wartime calls for a new monumentality that combined architecture, art and landscape in a unified response. It was his answer to an urbanism for the new world. Now, on the 20th of April 1948, Viennese-born architect Harry Seidler disembarked from the SS Argentina in Rio de Janeiro. And this is how Rio would have appeared in 1948. Seidler had just finished working in Marcel Breuer's New York office, and he was travelling en route to Australia to design a house for his parents, Rose and Max Seidler, on an as-yet unspecified site in Sydney. The young 24-year-old had an impressive pedigree. a graduate of the University of Manitoba. He was also a graduate of Harvard's GSD under Walter Gropius, and you can see Harry in the centre of the slide on the right. And he was also a graduate of Black Mountain College, where he studied under Joseph Albers. He was a registered Canadian architect, and he'd worked for nearly 2 years as Marcel Breuer's chief assistant, and he managed the 88th Street New York office, while Breuer was away working in Argentina and Colombia for 2 months in 1947. So he would have been very well aware of a job in the office at the time, the Ariston Club at Mar del Plata in Argentina. He had been at university at the GSD with a collaborator of Breuer, Eduardo Catalano, but more on him later. Seidler had brought with him to Brazil drawings from the Breuer office to prove his worth, and he immediately found work in the Copacabana office of Brazil's most famous modernist, Oscar Niemeyer. Niemeyer spoke little English, but was generous and hospitable, and he soon put the young architect to work on a linear block of elevated, north-facing housing units for the Instituto Tecnológico de Aeronáutica, the new aeronautical school, ITA, at São José dos Campos. Niemeyer took Seidler on site visits to the campus in his convertible Packard, and they also travelled to Sao Paulo. They viewed Assis Chateaubriand, the newspaper mogul, sort of the Brazilian version of Rupert Murdoch. They viewed Assis Chateaubriand's and Pietro Maria Bardi's modern art collection, then housed in the Diarios Associados newspaper building, and where Seidler was reported in the Brazilian press as being impressed with Italian émigré architect Lina Bobardi's inventive hanging technique that you see here of vertical steel tubes, a proposal that she would then reprise in the Museum of Modern Art with the paintings hanging by individual wires. Seidler made the most of his short time in Brazil. He visited Niemeyer's Church of St. Francis of Assisi at Pampulha, and this is one of Harry's slides from 1948. And he hired a rowboat and photographed Niemeyer's buildings from the lake, and was especially taken with the casino that you see here, the restaurant Bael with its umbilical cord-like canopy, and also the butterfly-roofed yacht club that he found, and I quote, quite extraordinary and flamboyantly rich in form. What struck Seidler most was the appearance of solidity through the use of reinforced concrete. It was a complete contrast to the lightness of his former employers, timber houses in Massachusetts. Back in Rio, Seidler returned to, and I quote, to work with Niemeyer even more devotedly and absorbing everything he had to say and write or do. He visited Niemeyer's day, and this is image of Harry with Oscar Niemeyer and colleagues on the right, and the Copacabana office on the left. He visited Niemeyer's day nursery at Gavea of 1937 on the left, with its adjustable vertical louvers. He also visited on the right the recently completed Boa Vista Bank of 1946, and two buildings he'd specifically expressed interest in seeing before leaving New York. Lucio Costa's and et al. It was a huge team which was involved in this building. Lucio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer et al.'s Ministry of Education and Health of 1936 to 42, and also Marcello and Milton Roberto's ABI building of 1936 to 8, with its fixed screen of concrete louvers. Importantly, and what would have been new to Seidler in experiencing these Brazilian buildings, was their landscape settings and their urban design features. The ITA project on which Seidler had worked was a collection of objects disposed artfully in a landscape field to create an aesthetically unified campus. Niemeyer's buildings at Pampulha in Belo Horizonte were combined with the designed landscapes of Roberto Burle Marx and juxtaposed against the artificial lake, Lagoa de Pampulha, with its sinuous curving inlets and gently rising banks. Adding to Seidler's urban experience there was that he encountered Niemeyer's church, page 4, church, casino and yacht club, not from the street, but from the water, from the position of landscape. Add in the experience of sculptures and murals of Candido Portinari, Paolo Wernicke, Alfredo Cesciati and Jose Pedrosa, amongst others, and Seidler would have felt that he was experiencing in the flesh the subject of Henry Russell Hitchcock's 1948 book On the Right, Painting Towards Architecture, the title of which Seidler would borrow for his 1949 article on the same topic. Seidler would also have been aware of the new and unique urban design features of the Rio buildings. Niemeyer's Boa Vista Bank presented a sinuous curving wall of glass brick at ground level, recasting the idea of the urban portico with Baroque assurance. The ABI building occupied a prominent urban street corner, emphasising its three-dimensional perforated prismatic form held aloft on pilotis and crowned by a setback sculptural rooftop. And perhaps most striking of all, the monumental Ministry of Education and Health with its accompanying urban plaza, rooftop landscape by Roberto Bell Marx, the Azulejos, the tiled mural by Portinari and sculpture by Celso Antonio, unequivocally redefined what a new urban landscape might be. In 1948, these would be formative experiences for Seidler, but arguably, the urban implications of these experiences and their synthesis would only be realised some 3.5 decades later. After leaving Brazil, Seidler travelled to Buenos Aires and he visited architect-engineer Eduardo Catalano, his old Harvard friend and Breuer's recent collaborator on the Ariston Club. There, they visited some of Catalano's factory buildings, which Seidler considered to be, and I quote, quite remarkable. But there wasn't time in his tight schedule to get to Mar del Plata. Seidler flew on to Santiago and then to Los Angeles before heading on to Australia, arriving at Sydney's Mascot Airport on the 15th of June 1948. Taken directly to his parents' very pathetic apartment, there's Harry's words, in suburban Maroubra, close to the airport, Seidler was initially completely unaware of the beauty of Sydney's harbour landscape. He was appalled, and he recalled thinking, and I'm quoting here, "My God, what have I come to?" Brazil, let alone New York, seemed far, far away. Now, in post-war Australia, Brazilian modernism, though, was well known through books and journals, and local interest was spurred on for two reasons: climate and the search for new form. In his 1945 book, Homes in the Sun, Sydney architect Walter Bunning, then Executive Officer of the Commonwealth Housing Commission, used images of Bernard Rudovsky's Arnstein House at Sao Paulo, so top right image, and the image beneath on the slide. And he also used Lucio Costa et al.'s Ministry of Health and Education, bottom right image, as appropriate climatic parallels to the verandas of Australian homesteads on the left. Other Australian architects like Frederick Romberg and Best Overend in Melbourne proposed a vast high-rise office complex with recreational facilities and catenary arched exhibition hall inspired by Brazilian modernism and set within the reconfigured gardens of a completely demolished Royal Exhibition buildings. At a similar scale, the exotic landscaping and catenary arched forms of Robin Boyd's supermarket and house at Jordanville of 1952-3 and Kevin Borland's Rice House at Eltham of 1952-3 were inspired by Brazil, even if their technology was not. More convincing was ICI House, Melbourne, where landscape designer John Stevens, a devotee of Brazilian landscape architect Roberto Bell Marx, worked with the sculptor Gerald Lewis and the architects Bates, Smart and McCutcheon to produce a convincing ensemble of office slab and landscape plaza that nodded both to Rio's Ministry of Education and Health and also to New York's UN headquarters. Now, where the forms of South American modernism were most commonly found was in religious buildings. Inspired by the churches of Felix Candela and Oscar Niemeyer that offered daring new alternatives to the Gothic vault, Australian architects from the 1950s to the early 1960s explored the catenary arch and folded concrete forms to the same end, a new language for the post-war modern church. Yet this search for a new monumentality reached its apotheosis, not with a church, but in a project dedicated to science. This was Borland, Murphy and McIntyre's 1956 entry for the Australian Academy of Science in Canberra. It was a series of shell vaults with a ventilating spire for its basement plant room. I'll see it on the far right. Other projects, like James Birrell's centenary pool in subtropical Brisbane, echoed the Aristons Club's aerial amoebic forms, but these were largely one-off experiments, and this team design never got further than being a competition entry. Now, it's also important to note, however, that a small number of Australian architects visited South America and, like Harry Seidler, experienced first-hand examples of Brazilian moderns in the period 1945 to 1960. One of the first was Commonwealth Department of Works architect Charles Howard, who visited North and South America with H.V. Riley, architect in charge of the Commonwealth Bank Works Department, as part of a government-sponsored fact-finding mission in the second half of 1945. They met Brazilian architects Marcelo Roberto and Oscar Niemeyer. They visited buildings like the ABI building, the Ministry of Education and Health, and Niemeyer's own house, which is in the very middle of the screen at the top, in Rio de Janeiro, as well as his buildings in Pampulha at Belo Horizonte, bottom central image. Howard's commentary in his report, which is called Architectural Mission to the Americas, focused mainly on these architects who are responsible for designing and building some of the most modern structures in the world, and their adoption of tropical design elements aimed at climatic control. Melbourne architect Arthur Stevenson travelled extensively in South America in 1949 to 50 on his world tour investigating contemporary hospital design in Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile and Peru. Likewise, Reuben Lane worked in Niemeyer's Brasilia studio for 8 months in 1958, and he later produced the formerly exuberant Breen House at Cronulla, 1969 to 73. Nonetheless, it was ultimately Harry Seidler who offered the most convincing, original and sustained recasting of Brazilian modernism in Australia. In 1952, just 4 years after Seidler's arrival in Australia, Boyd remarked on the influence on Seidler of Gropius, Breuer and Niemeyer that had been welded with understanding sincerity by an imaginative disciple, Robin Boyd's words. This perceptive observation needs to be borne in mind when considering Seidler's work more broadly. Throughout his 50-year career, Seidler synthesised, reworked and recast many ideas as he developed over time his own métier through the pursuit of consistent themes. His experience, memory and the lessons of Brazil were among, not the only, of these many ideas. Seidler's, as many of us know, first completed project in Australia was the Rose Seidler House in Sydney's outer bush suburb of Wahroonga. In 1957, American architect Paul Rudolph described it as the Harvard House incarnate, that it had jumped from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Sydney, which he spelt incorrectly, without any modifications whatsoever. It certainly did that, almost. But Rudolph overlooked aspects of the design, such as the ramp, which led up to a sun deck that was graced by a vividly covered abstract mural, two elements that did not appear in any of Seidler's mentor's residential works. Instead, the ramp of Costa Niemeyer's Brazilian Pavilion and the Pampulha Yacht Club, as well as Candido Portinari's Azulejos mural at the Ministry of Education and Health, come to mind here. But Seidler rationalised the ramp into a straight line and painted the mural himself, drawing on his experiences with Albers at Black Mountain College. Portinari's murals were always figurative, never abstract, and Seidler's mural draws more from Paolo Wernick's abstract mosaics that you see bottom right at St Francis of Assisi. It's an integral component of a de Stael composition, a third wall to the living room that we see there on the left. And what other scholars have neglected to point out is that the deck of the Seidler House faces out onto an untouched Indigenous landscape. Seidler's fourth wall is both a framed view of landscape and an extended spatial field that lies beyond the boundary of the building. This claiming or harnessing of the Australian landscape, both as a framed panorama and extended spatial field, would become a Seidler trademark, and not just of his houses, but also his city skyscrapers. The welding of modernist sources was Seidler's great skill, and one that would increase with sophistication as he learned more and quickly about Australia's unforgiving climate, especially the force of its sun. Almost immediately, Seidler began adding louvers and sunshades as a way of modulating and imparting shadow to his modernist box houses. And in doing so, he pushed the plan back into the box. Very quickly, the north faces of all of his houses took the form of protective shaded visors, a tactic also employed by Niemeyer. Murals were also sometimes included at a house in Beecroft in 1950 and significantly at the Marcus Seidler House at Wahroonga, where Seidler's abstract mural was joined by blue-grey vertical louvers, movable vertical louvers, a butterfly roof and, that you can't see in the slide, a deep north-facing elevated visor now labelled as a terrace. The initial model for the Mellor House at Castlecrag had hollow terracotta pipe screens that you see there on the left, the model, like those on the right at Lucio Costa's Parque Eduardo Guinle housing in Rio, in addition to the now familiar louvals and deep shading visor that underscored the dramatic profile of the house's butterfly roof. There were echoes here at the Mellor House of Niemeyer's Yacht Club and the Kubitschek House, as well as the internal ramps of Le Corbusier's Errázuriz house in Zapaya in Chile, and also Niemeyer's own home at Gavea, which Seidler had visited in 1948. Here we see in Seidler's work art and architectural tactics to deploy shade functionally and artistically. These were the lessons of South America, and all were used by Seidler to acclimatise his modernism. And so response to climate became a preoccupation in the 50s. Seidler was a fast learner. On a visit in 1953 to Surfers Paradise in Queensland, Seidler spoke to residents making comparisons with the climates of Brazil, Florida and southern Queensland. And he showed slides of buildings in Rio de Janeiro as appropriate future models for the Gold Coast. But this was as far urbanistically that Seidler was able to go in 1953. Preoccupied here in Sydney with dozens of residential commissions, he was intent instead on finding an appropriate language with which to manage climate. In particular, Seidler explored the louver, whether in timber, aluminium and concrete, horizontally and vertically, in movable and in fixed form, as well as a complete sculptural screen in built large and small projects for Sydney and Melbourne. Sydney on the left, Melbourne on the right. At the Pasquale House in subtropical Darwin of 1959, Seidler transformed the visor into a double-storey brise-soleil, while for the Printers Union in Sydney of 1959, the entire egg crate concrete facade read on the one hand like an Albers-like métier and on the other as a supremely practical response to shading an all-glass facade. Unlike Marcel Breuer, Seidler's interest in sun and shadow was not just an abstract concept of aesthetic opposites. It was also a practical, technical and artistic task driven and determined by the necessities of place, evidenced later in the monumental rendition of the louver in his McLaren Street office building for North Sydney that we see here, 1971-2. And Polly Seidler alerted me to this image on the right with this fantastic Brazilian-inspired, perhaps Copacabana Beach tiling on the right. And perhaps the apotheosis of this idea of the monumental louver in the firm's offices at Milson's Point of 1971-3. Seidler also drew upon the other attraction of Brazilian modernism, the search for new form. Though few of these early projects were realised, each indicated Seidler's desire to experiment with reinforced concrete. Here we see his 1952 entry for Melbourne's Olympic Stadium. It was a structural tour de force with an elliptical dish emerging from the earth connected to a shell concrete restaurant building that you see bottom right. and a design, I have to say, just as a side comment, that was hugely influential to Kevin Ball and Peter McIntyre and John and Phyllis Murphy, the section for the Melbourne Olympic Swimming Stadium. Seidler's swimming stadium entry for Melbourne was a dramatic ovoid concrete shell with its leg ends clad in coloured ceramic tiles and propped up on one side by a series of tapered concrete legs. But the most convincing of these formal explorations was built. For the Williamson House in Mossman, Seidler took advantage of panoramic views across Middle Harbour. He inverted Villa Savoy, that's my licence in describing this. He placed the cars on the roof beneath a double parabolic arch shell, and he pushed the glazed wall back into the box, that familiar tactic, to form a visor again, while concrete pilotis negotiated the precipitous rocky landscape below. One of the smartest rethinking of Villa Savoy. New form also informed projects for multiple housing. Seidler's proposal for a student hostel at the University of Sydney combined a shell concrete roof structure, fixed vertical fins, pivoting sun awnings, terracotta screens, a dominating mural, as it was described, and an elevated linear block of tapered pilotis. Though unbuilt and a deft melding of elements from Le Corbusier, Marcel Breuer and Oscar Niemeyer, Seidler's ambition was clear: to use mass and build modernist apartment buildings and transform Sydney's urban fabric. The Glenview Apartments and Ithaca Gardens captured harbour and ocean landscapes, and they were the prelude to a dramatic proposal for the complete redevelopment of McMahon's Point of 1957. A Brazilian-inspired V-radieurs of slab towers, masonettes, sound shell, community and commercial structures on the northern side of Sydney Harbour. Then, just a few years later, on the city side, Seidler's daring scheme for the Rocks development, a 10,000-person community adjacent to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, was a series of undulating, curving slabs held aloft on tapering columns and splayed V-shaped prongs that stepped across the contours of the harbour landscape. Had both schemes been completed, we see both schemes here, each would have joined across the water as a fully resolved, unified modernist ensemble of architecture and landscape, worthy of the spaces of Rio de Janeiro. So one needs to think, when one sees these two schemes together, that the harbour itself, the water, is part of this extended landscape between these two developments. But more significantly, the landscapes of both projects were topographically driven, where slope, contour and the serpentine curves of coastline were given preference and enhanced. In 1957, Seidler proclaimed to Sydney-siders that their city was, and I quote, matched possibly only by the Brazilian capital of Rio de Janeiro, and that Sydney could, and I quote again, boast several hundred miles of harbour coastline with views and building sites which are the envy of the world. Now, despite these grand urban projects never being realised, Seidler's career blossomed in the 1960s, and overtly Brazilian references appeared to actually fade from view. This was partly due to his diversifying aesthetic interests and the increasing scale of his commissions, especially the office and urban ensemble of Australia Square in Sydney of 1960 to 67. Seidler's interest in concrete expanded dramatically following collaboration with Pierluigi Nervi on the tower's structural design. Additionally, Seidler's urban gestures, while decidedly modernist in their faith in opening up the city at ground level, reflected an increasing respect for the urban spaces of Baroque Rome. Of particular fascination for Seidler during the 1960s were the urban spaces created by Borromini's San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane and Bernini's San Andrea del Quirinale, both of which he and Penelope visited in 1963 and which Seidler referred to in his 1973 monograph, pages which you see on the screen now. And you can see San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, top right, and the plan of San Andrea al Quirinale on the far right. In 1976, as a guest professor at Harvard's GSD, Seidler ran a seminar devoted to the Baroque At a time when modernism was coming under increasing attack, the Baroque for Seidler represented an historic bulwark for the modern project. Seidler had not been immune to an emerging critique of modernism in the previous decade. In addition to his interest in megastructural systems and changing section T-beams to create column-free office space, curves began to appear in building forms and plans from a variety of sources. Frank Steller's paintings, Norman Carlberg's sculptures, Nervi's isostatic sculptural lines, and significantly, the geometries of the Baroque. All had a rational, mathematical basis, except this wasn't the case for the free-form curves of the garden walls at the Acapulco condominium in Mexico on the left, nor in the curved walls and enclosures of Seidler's playground for the New South Wales Housing Commission at Rosebery on the right, where Peter Blake observed in 1973, and I'm going to read this quote. Peter Blake, the American critic writing in Architecture for the New World in 1973, says, "This labyrinth is about as free a departure from 20th century urban design as has been built in some time. For it is, of course, not really a labyrinth for children to play in, but, as suggested above, a maquette of a different kind of city." And this is what Seidler was interested in, a different kind of city. From the late 1970s, Seidler, now in his 50s, began to explore just that, a different kind of city, in large, urban-scaled projects across Australia and also tropical Asia. The Hong Kong Club and Office Tower signalled Seidler's mastery of a Borromini-inspired facade and Baroque interior space. But it was the Riverside Centre in Brisbane of 1983 to 6 that realised the full import of Blake's words. Initially projected, we see it here on the right, to contain a cylindrical hotel, marina, a low wave-shaped building and a main multi-storey office tower, and a lush riverbank landscape of amoebic curves. The final scheme, which resulted in the 40-storey tower and a modified landscape, nevertheless constituted, as Kenneth Frampton noted, and I quote again, "the first landscape complex anywhere to pick up where Niemeyer and Burl-Marx left off in the late 1950s. Riverside may be read as a tectonically rigorous but topographically inflected work." Here, Seidler achieved his ultimate personal synthesis. His Baroque intentions were realised not through historic reference, but through a personally inflected language that owed something to Nervi, something to Borromini, something to Marcel Breuer, but now the landscapes of Burl-Marx and the urban visions of Lucio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer. But the signature was undeniably Seidler. Riverside was his solution to the problems of urban space in Australian architecture, and it was a strident counter to planning controls that demanded return to the street wall of buildings that had characterised Australian cities through the 20s until the 1950s. Seidler was unflinching in his loyalty not just to Gideon's 1941 celebration of the Baroque as a new power to mould space and to produce an astonishing and unified whole from the most various parts, and also Borromini's contribution of the undulating wall as the natural accompaniment to the flowing spaces of the flexible ground plan, but also to Siegfried Gideon's belief that an office building like the Ministry of Education in Rio might signal a direction for the fusion of architecture, art and landscape in the service of monumentality. And Sert and Leger's 1943 statement that man-made landscapes would be correlated with nature's landscapes, and all elements combined in terms of a new and vast facade, sometimes extending for many miles. For Seidler, the Australian landscape was that new and vast facade, where a new urbanism, with all the spatial fluidity and aesthetic and ideological unity of the purpose of the Baroque, might be nurtured through a modernist synthesis of structure, space, art, and significantly, the unifying landscape of the topos. Thereafter, and it has to be said, not without his critics, Seidler's urbanism from the 1980s reached a new maturity, with a brace of office buildings, apartments and single houses across the nation, where his mastery of the curve took hold. As always, Seidler's main aim was to bracket out the historic city and harness a site's views of a much larger landscape. Harry Seidler considered the landscape of Sydney Harbour as a field of urban potential, just as Le Corbusier had done in 1929 in Rio de Janeiro. It's the reason why Seidler also felt so strongly about Utzon's Opera House. Engagement with the harbour landscape was its constituent and intrinsic aspect. Seidler believed that this was the key to Sydney's urban identity, just as the river was in Brisbane, an identity based not on a palimpsest of styles or the complex spatial grain of the historic city. That the validity of Seidler's urbanism has never been documented nor tested theoretically points not just to the narrowness of urban design scholarship in Australia, but also the power of aesthetic benchmarks for the city in the 70s and 80s. That, while in favour of pedestrianisation and the reclaiming of the right to the city, the models were almost always those of Europe and never across to a similar geography, climate and post-war modernism that could be found in South America. However, even if one admits the need to acknowledge a city's complexity and that the palimpsest of history imbues a city with richness, and even if aspects of the urbanism of the New World of South America might be found to be flawed, the fact of its scholarly neglect in an Australian setting parallels an earlier lacuna. It would take multiple decades for architectural history to properly acknowledge Le Corbusier's lifelong debt to South America, with extensive revisionist scholarship in the first decades of the 21st century. The same might be said of Harry Seidler, that Brazil was a lifelong interest only fully synthesised and realised in built and urban form in the last 2 decades of his life. However, that's not all. On Seidler's part, he considered his connection to Brazil to be personal. He continued to visit Oscar Niemeyer over the years. In 1974 with his wife Penelope in 1981 and again in 1993, as well as writing on Niemeyer in Werk, Bauen and Wohnen in 1994. So he wrote in 1994 in Werk, Bauen and Wohnen, and he reviewed Niemeyer's Museum of Modern Art at Niterói after visiting the building with Niemeyer during its construction. In that article, there's a photograph of the pair together in Rio de Janeiro in 1993. Niemeyer at 86, Seidler at age 70, and it accompanied the article in Werk. Seidler, who had been in Brazil to attend the Sao Paulo Biennale, also wrote glowingly of Niemeyer's exhibition hall and other buildings at Ibirapura Park, which date from the early 1950s and were disposed like sculptures across its lush tropical setting. Seidler also wrote, at that time, about Brasilia, coming to its defence, arguing that it was reaching a new level of maturity. Now, in the previous 3 decades, Seidler had, perhaps unconsciously, avoided writing about the monumental sculptural tableau that was the Brazilian capital. But in 1994, Seidler, now himself the target of postmodern revisionism in Australia, defended Brasilia, arguing that many of the city's critics had never even been to Brazil. Inclined, as always, to argue on the basis of experience, Seidler by 1993 had visited Brasilia and was able to confidently talk about its life in the streets, its residential areas, and its carefree pedestrian landscapes. As if in reflection on his own career and more recent buildings that might have earned labels of Baroque flamboyance, Seidler too spoke of the aesthetic mantle which Niemeyer's work had carried since the early 1940s, when Gropius had labelled Niemeyer as the architectural world's bird of paradise. This is Harry writing. Niemeyer's work was considered to be something unbelievable, rather unworldly, admirable, and at the same time despicable, and that the image of the forbidden fruit clung to him, constantly forced to justify himself. Clearly, the careers of Niemeyer and Seidler had ultimately different trajectories, but Seidler empathised with the veiled and unveiled criticism that followed Niemeyer's work throughout his career. Significantly in the article, Seidler noted his working for Niemeyer in 1948 and his observation then that Niemeyer worked like a painter or sculptor in contrast to the European-American method he knew. Sketches, intuitive gestures, ideas presented in a way that every rationalistic designer must fear. The exuberant curves of Seidler's unbuilt projects, his unbuilt urban schemes of the early 1960s and his skyscrapers, apartment buildings and urban landscapes from the early 1980s certainly showed no fear. That Seidler possessed a lifelong admiration for Niemeyer was further demonstrated by his attendance with Penelope on the 23rd of November 1998 at the presentation of the RBIA Gold Medal to Oscar Niemeyer in Rio de Janeiro. While in Rio, the Seidlers visited an exhibition of Niemeyer's work and also Roberto Belmarx's garden at Barra de Guarachiba. There is some further irony in the fact that nearly 4 decades earlier, in 1960, a journalist here in this city said, and I quote, "6 or 7 years ago, it might have appeared that Harry Seidler was to be the Frank Lloyd Wright of Australian architecture. Now it seems that he may make his contribution as an Oscar Niemeyer." It was a statement that would ultimately prove prophetic. Thank you very much. Almost certainly, but it was not the first book that Australian architects and Harry Seidler was familiar with. You have Philip Goad's Brazil Builds of 1943, which I know Harry owned, and also there's Henrique Mindland. When you said Henry, I thought it was in Henrique Mindland's book of, it's around 52, 53. There's Stamo Papadakis' books on Niemeyer, and there's Henry Russell Hitchcock's book of 1955. And you're absolutely right, but there's a steady stream of these wonderful, beautifully illustrated publications on South American modernism that are available globally. And I think one of the impacts of Brazilian modernism was that they hadn't experienced post-war destruction. And so in terms of the architectural press, everyone was hungry in years of austere post-war reconstruction in Europe for these wonderful images and these visions of city building that the Brazilians had already embraced since the late 1930s. And you're right. The other aspect to the Henry Russell Hitchcock book is that it was also part of the US government's soft Cold War diplomacy of keeping Latin America in their pocket, so to speak. And so there are lots of cultural exchanges, and this is particularly the reason for the Brazil Builds exhibition run by MoMA in 42, 43. Yeah, but you're right. Yeah. To my knowledge, no, and Penelope may be able to give an answer, but to my knowledge, no. Had the landscape designer John Stevens been in Sydney, I think they would have just clicked. When I interviewed John Stevens about ICI House, he said the person he wanted to touch the hem of was Roberto Belmarx. And that was why the landscaping of ICI House was so extraordinary. And after that commission, John Stevens used to do Brazilian-inspired ground-level landscapes for Melbourne office towers, CRA, a number of insurance company offices as well, but never really found an architectural firm where the two might connect. And there might be others in the room who might be expert, but I don't believe Harry found a landscape architect with the same, if you like, vision. Yeah. So one aspect that I haven't referred to is, in terms of the issue to do with climate, Harry was an avid user of sun control diagrams, and Colin Griffith can probably confirm this, but everything was scientifically engineered as well as looking fabulous. You know, it is remarkable. He was, when some of those smaller office buildings with the louvered facades were built, published alongside them are all the sun diagrams and the calculations to get it right for the Sydney climate. Yeah. Look, they wouldn't necessarily have an engagement in that regard. And clearly, Oscar Niemeyer's politics were very, very, very different. And also the idea of urban space in South America generally is very different from what would have been here in what would have been understood in the 1950s and 60s. I think Seidler appreciated Niemeyer for his ability as an architect It's almost sort of professional to professional respect for the skill and the deftness that he could bring to designing urban space, as opposed to, if you like, a social mission. Whereas Niemeyer, I think you could write a book about the conflicting moments between his ideas of sociability and the politics of the day in Brazil. It's a very complex, and someone has yet to tackle, I think, Harry's politics and the city. It's another story about how Australian cities are made. Yeah, is that? I would say that Seidler was, whenever he travelled, he would make contact with architects. But on the issue of housing, I think his commitment to the idea of housing Australians is very interesting. The fact that he did, in large part, affordable multiple housing. He did work for the Housing Commission here in New South Wales. It was part of his mission as well, and one that has been virtually unstudied. You know, his explorations of housing typologies are very sophisticated, and you're right, they do borrow from Afonso Reedy's Pedregalho project, which hadn't been finished when Harry visited in 48.
I have a less academic question.
Yeah. Just on the Niemeyer involvement with the United Nations, that project really isn't finished until Seidler's come to Australia. But I think he's gained international fame already with Costa on the Ministry of Education and Health. I think it's one of the most important buildings of 20th century modernism. Which
I think winning Archon Le Corbusier on the United Nations, that really...
Yeah. Oh, it was big. It was big news. Absolutely, and perhaps more cogently described as being related to South Africa at the time within the architectural journals. So in the published version of bit of this paper, there's a whole section devoted to South Africa where, oddly enough, Johannesburg was described as a little Rio in Africa. Go figure. But going back to your question about sociability, the reason that Brazil was looked at was to do with like politics, and it was to do with really a transformative political gesture that was associated with architecture and public buildings. But in terms of South Africa's connections, there are great connections, and many South Africans travelled to South America. So it's a really good question, which then opens up the question, well, surely there should be more literature just generally about these South-South discussions.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes. I don't want to do self-promotion, but there's an article in Fabrications which deals with that South African question. The Anschluss in Vienna was a defining moment for them to make a decision to leave Nazi-occupied Austria. Harry had the good fortune, his parents were very smart, had the good fortune to be sponsored through Quaker-related charitable bodies. He and his brother were shipped off to the UK, and there was great histories where he's then interned as an enemy alien in the UK and then deported as an enemy alien to Canada, and has to spend part of the war years in an internment camp. Meanwhile, the family, the parents, had made their way to Australia. And I'm not really completely familiar with why Australia, but inevitably the choices for many Jewish families leaving Vienna was, as you say, Canada, the US, some parts of South America and Australia, or New Zealand. But I think the rationale of getting away as far as possible would have been a good one. Clearly, too, in Australia, there would have been a strong Jewish community to actually assist. And that's another area of enormous research still to be done. It's only being done now in the UK, of the role of refugee and welfare agencies and sponsoring agencies like the Quakers, who did an amazing job in helping people flee parts of Europe.